The photograph had been handled so many times that its edges had gone soft and feathery, the way old things do when they have been loved past their usefulness. Eleanor Marsh held it at arm's length in the swaying train car, studying the face of a man she had never met but had agreed to marry. James Alderton. The name had a sensible weight to it, like a good iron skillet. He had written to her in November, responding to the notice she had placed in the Cincinnati Gazette, a notice that had cost her the last of her schoolteacher's savings and a considerable measure of her pride. Schoolmistress, 24, of sound character and practical disposition, seeks correspondence with honorable Western gentlemen with the purpose of matrimony and mutual betterment. His reply had arrived within 3 weeks, written in a careful, upright hand that suggested a man who took the world seriously. He had described his sheep ranch outside the town of Harlan, Wyoming, the wide valley it sat in, the creek that split his lower pasture in two and never once ran dry. And in his 4th letter, the one she had nearly memorized, he had answered her careful question about loneliness. The question she had been almost too embarrassed to ask, with a single line that had decided everything. The nights are quiet here, but they are not empty. There is always something worth listening to. Quiet, but not empty. She had read those words on the hardest night of her life, the night after she had stood in a church in Columbus and watched the doors stay closed and the clock on the wall tick past the hour when Samuel Green was supposed to walk through them. He had not. He never did. His brother had come instead, hat in hand, face wretched, to tell her there had been a change of heart. That was how he had said it, a change of heart, as though Samuel's feelings had simply shifted direction, like weather. As though Eleanor's entire future had not been disassembled brick by brick in front of a congregation of witnesses, she had smiled, thanked the brother, and walked herself home through the rain. She had not cried until she was inside with the door closed and the curtains drawn. She allowed herself one night. In the morning, she had made tea, sat at her kitchen table, and begun to think practically about what came next. That was Eleanor Marsh. She did not collapse. She made tea and thought. James Alderton's letter had been part of what came next. The train swayed on. Outside the window, the Ohio farmland she knew had been replaced, first by the flat immensity of the plains and now, over the past several hours, by the muscular rise of hills giving way to genuine mountains. Wyoming. She was 3 days from anything familiar and moving further away with every rotation of the wheels. She tucked the photograph back into her coat pocket, pressed it flat with her palm, and fixed her eyes on the peaks. She was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid, but she had decided the fear was not in charge. The conductor came through the car, calling the stop. Harlan. 20 minutes to Harlan. Eleanor gathered her traveling bag, smoothed her dark green coat, and settled her hat more firmly on her head. She had one trunk in the luggage car. Everything she owned fit inside it, which was either a tragedy or a freedom she had not yet decided which. The Harlan station was a modest building of raw pine that still smelled of fresh lumber. The platform was only half built, its far end tapering off into bare earth and sawdust, the new town still becoming itself. Eleanor stepped down from the train into the sharp, clear air of an October afternoon, the mountains rising enormous to the west, their peaks already white. She stood very still and looked around. Families reuniting, a freight wagon loading crates, a dog asleep under the station bench, its ears twitching at the noise. No James Alderton. She waited 1 full hour. She knew how to wait without letting it show. She sat on the station bench with her bag in her lap and her hands folded over it, her face arranged in the expression of a woman who had somewhere to be and was in no particular hurry to get there. Inside, something cold and familiar was settling into her chest. The station agent, a young man with ink on his fingers, came out to lock up as the light turned golden. He paused when he saw her still sitting there. "Ma'am, you waiting on somebody?" "I am," she said pleasantly. He may have been delayed. The young man looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, opened his mouth, closed it again. "What's the name? Maybe I heard something." "Alderton," she said. "James Alderton." Something moved across the young man's face. A flicker of recognition and then, worse, pity. He looked down at his keys. I'm sorry, ma'am. Mr. Alderton left Harlan about 2 weeks back, sold off his flock to the Hendersons and loaded his wagon. Folks say he went up to Oregon. He could not look at her. I didn't know he was. I'm sorry. The cold thing in Eleanor's chest spread outward and settled into her fingertips. Oregon, she thought. He sold his sheep. He had time to arrange the sale of his flock, load a wagon, and travel to another territory. He had not had time to write a letter. She was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. The young man was relieved to be dismissed. He locked the station door and hurried away, his boot heels rapid on the platform boards. The sun was dropping fast behind the peaks. Eleanor sat alone on the platform as the light went red and then violet. The temperature fell with the efficiency of high country evenings. She was calculating. She had $11 in her coat pocket and perhaps $4 in coin at the bottom of her traveling bag. Her return ticket to Ohio would cost more than that. Even if she had enough, there was nothing in Ohio to return to. Her rooms had been let, her teaching position filled. She had burned those bridges with cheerful thoroughness, believing she was building a fire to light a new road, not a fire that would leave her standing in the dark. She heard the creak and clatter of a wagon coming down the road from town. It stopped where the road met the station, and a figure climbed down. She could not see the face yet, only the shape, a man in a working coat, lean but broad through the shoulders, his hat pushed back on his head. He walked toward her with a slight limp she would notice only later, the kind earned rather than born. He was perhaps 35, though the weathering of outdoor life made it hard to say exactly. His face, when he came close enough for her to see it, was angular and serious, with deep-set eyes that were looking at her with direct and uncomplicated attention, not the ogling of the saloon or the assessment of the marketplace, but simply the look of a man trying to understand what he was seeing. "Evening," he said. His voice was level and quiet. "Evening," she replied. He looked at the platform, at her trunk, at the station door locked behind her. He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "My boy was supposed to be on that train. He wasn't. I was watching for him, and I saw you sitting here when it pulled out." He paused. "I'm going to ask a plain question, and you can tell me to mind my own business if you like. Are you all right?" It was the plainness of it that got past her defenses. Not an offer, not a solution, just a plain question that acknowledged she might not be. "I am not entirely sure," she said honestly. He nodded, as though that were a completely satisfactory answer. "I'm Thomas Cade," he said. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles north. My wagon's right there. Is there someone in town expecting you? Or—" "There is no one," she said. "The man I was to meet has apparently gone to Oregon." Thomas Cade was quiet for a moment. He put his hat back on his head. "Mrs. Pendleton runs the only boarding house in Harlan. It's clean and she's a fair woman." He walked back to the wagon without another word, and she heard him rummaging in the bed of it. He came back carrying a folded horse blanket, which he held out to her. "For the ride into town, it gets cold fast." He did not wait for her to accept or decline. He went and loaded her trunk into the wagon bed as though the matter were settled, and she supposed, looking at her alternatives, that it was. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and climbed up onto the wagon seat. They drove into Harlan in the dark. He did not speak much, and when he did, it was not about her situation or herself. He pointed out the general store, the church, the schoolhouse, which was a one-room building with a small bell tower, and said, almost as an afterthought, that the schoolteacher had left in September to get married, and the town hadn't found a replacement. He said it the same way he might mention that the creek had been running low. Just a fact, existing on its own. She filed it away. Mrs. Pendleton was a spare, tall woman of about 60, with the posture of a person who had decided many years ago that the world would simply have to adjust to her. She took one look at Eleanor on her doorstep, glanced at Thomas Cade behind her, and said briskly, "Come in then, before the cold does." He paid for her first week before Eleanor could speak. She caught up with him at the door. "Mr. Cade." He turned. "I will pay you back. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a moment with those direct, steady eyes. "I expect you will," he said, and then he was gone, his wagon creaking back down the dark street. The first 2 weeks in Harlan were an exercise in Eleanor Marsh's particular variety of quiet determination. She presented herself to the school board, 3 men who met in the back room of the general store, and was hired as the interim schoolteacher before they had quite finished deliberating, largely because she answered every question they asked with calm precision, and there was no one else. She had 16 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, in a room with 2 cracked windows and a stove that drew poorly. She fixed the stove flue herself on the 3rd day, climbing onto the roof with a length of wire and a patience that exhausted the children watching from the yard below. She saw Thomas Cade twice during those weeks, once in the general store, where he nodded at her and went on buying his supplies, once on the road out of town, where he was driving a wagon loaded with wool bales and pulled up to tell her, without preamble, that the road flooded at the low crossing in hard rain and she should know which way around it to go. Both times, he said what needed to be said, and nothing more. She found herself thinking about him in the quiet of her boarding house room, not with the warm, imaginary feeling she had carried for James Alderton across 3 days of train travel, but with a different kind of attention. He was a person whose actions meant something because he did not spend them carelessly. On a Thursday morning, at the end of October, Mrs. Pendleton knocked on her door before breakfast. "Thomas Cade is downstairs." Eleanor came down to find him in the front hallway, hat in his hands again. He had a boy with him. The child was perhaps 8 years old, with Thomas's same angular face and dark hair. But where the father was composed, the boy was a wound pulled tight. He stood close to Thomas's leg and looked at the floor and said nothing. "This is my son, William," Thomas said. "He's been staying with my sister in Cheyenne since his mother passed. She put him on the train to come home. He made it." Something shifted in Eleanor's understanding. The boy on the train he had been waiting for. The boy who had not been on the train after all. "Hello, William," she said. William did not look up. "He hasn't spoken much," Thomas said quietly, without embarrassment, as one states a weather condition. "Not since his mother. That was in March." He looked at Eleanor steadily. "He'll be in your school starting Monday." "I'll be glad to have him," she said, and meant it. William came on Monday and sat at the back of the room and looked at his desk. He did not speak when called upon. He did not speak at lunch. But he was watching, she could feel it, a sharp and careful attention behind his downcast eyes. That first week, she made no demands of him. She taught the others their lessons and let him listen. On Wednesday, she read aloud to the class after the midday break. She chose a book about horses, their breeds, their history, the great horse herds of the plains. She did not look at William while she read, but when she set the book down at the close of the day, she found a small piece of paper on her desk. On it, in uncertain, earnest letters, was written, "What kind is fastest?" She did not make a production of it. She simply picked up her chalk and wrote on the board, "The American quarter horse can run a quarter-mile faster than any other breed. Come early tomorrow, and I'll show you the chapter." He came 40 minutes before the other children. She showed him the chapter. She sat at her desk, and he sat in the front row, and they read together in the quiet of the early morning, the stove ticking warmth into the room, the mountains going pink through the cracked window glass. That was how it began. Thomas Cade appeared at her door on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks later. The wind had turned mean, rattling the school's windows and driving grit under the door. Most of the children had been picked up early by parents who'd seen the sky. Eleanor was banking the stove when she heard the knock. He stood in the doorway with snow on his hat brim. "Roads are going to be bad by morning," he said. "I'm headed back now." William said to ask if you wanted a ride, since the boarding house is on the way. She could see William in the wagon behind him, his face barely visible above the wagon rail, watching. "That's kind of him," Eleanor said. She gathered her coat. The ride out to the boarding house took longer than usual in the thickening weather. William sat between them on the wagon seat, which seemed to be his choice rather than anyone's arrangement. He had a picture of a horse he'd torn from a catalog. She recognized it from the general store display, and he showed it to her sideways, without comment, as if merely giving her the opportunity to look at it. "Quarter horse?" she guessed. He gave a single, solemn nod. Thomas was looking straight ahead at the road, but something around his eyes had eased. At the boarding house, she climbed down and thanked them both. Thomas nodded. Then William, unprompted, raised one hand in a small, deliberate wave. She waved back. Walking inside, she thought, something is happening here. She wasn't entirely sure what to do about it. Through November and into December, Thomas Cade found reasons to be in town on school days. He was not obvious about it. He brought wool to the mill. He had business at the land office. He needed something from the hardware store, but he always seemed to know when her school day ended, and his wagon was always somehow nearby. He began leaving things in the basket of books she kept by the school door, a jar of honey with no note, a small twist of peppermint sticks that she understood were really for William, a piece of pine he had carved into a rough but recognizable horse. William claimed the horse immediately and carried it everywhere in his coat pocket. She kept the honey. She noticed the way Thomas moved through the world economically, without waste, the way a man moves who has learned that effort is a finite resource and should be spent wisely. She noticed that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he did speak, the words were exact. She noticed that he was never unkind, not to his son, not to the station boy, not to the difficult man at the feed store who always shortchanged him on weight. He simply looked at that man until the scale was adjusted, then paid and left. She found herself comparing these observations to her memories of Samuel Green, and the comparison was not flattering to Samuel. Samuel had been charming. He had brought her flowers and told her she was remarkable. Thomas Cade had brought her honey and repaired her school stove flue without being asked, climbing onto the roof one Saturday when he'd come to collect William's forgotten coat and noticed the smoke pulling wrong. He had not mentioned it afterward. The letter arrived on a Thursday in December, slid under the boarding house door while Eleanor was at school. Mrs. Pendleton left it on the table without comment, but her expression when Eleanor came home said enough. The return address was Columbus, Ohio. Inside was a single sheet, written in a hand she didn't know, but the name signed at the bottom was Samuel Green's mother, a woman who had always looked at Eleanor as though she were a piece of evidence. "Miss Marsh," it read, "it has come to our attention that you have placed matrimonial notices in multiple publications, a practice that speaks to a character less upright than you presented to our family." Samuel was wise to remove himself from the entanglement before it became a true embarrassment. "We write only to advise you not to contact our son or involve his name further in your efforts to secure yourself a husband through advertisement. We trust you understand." Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. Mrs. Pendleton brought tea without being asked and sat across from her, not speaking, which was more comfort than words would have been. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then, she folded it precisely along its original creases and held it between her hands. The anger she felt was clean and cold, not the hot, scalding kind, but the clarifying kind, the kind that burns away everything except what is true. She had placed one notice. She had written to one man in response to one reply. She had conducted herself with complete propriety. And still a man who had humiliated her in front of a full congregation on what was to have been her wedding day was, from the safety of his mother's drawing room, attempting to assign her the shame he had earned. She thought about writing back. She composed 3 different letters in her head, each one more precise and devastating than the last. She thought about the pleasure of sending one, and then she thought of William's serious face at the front of the classroom, bent over the horse catalog. She thought of Thomas Cade on the school roof, adjusting the flue in silence. She thought of the life that was quietly assembling itself around her in this raw, half-built town at the foot of the Wyoming mountains, and she thought, this letter has nothing to do with that life. "I'm not going to answer it," she said aloud. Mrs. Pendleton wrapped both hands around her own teacup. "Good," she said simply. Eleanor put the letter in the stove. She watched it burn to nothing. The following Friday, she stayed late at the school. The children had done their last examinations before the Christmas holiday, and she was marking papers by lamplight when she heard boots on the step and a knock at the door. Thomas Cade came in, snow on his shoulders, his hat in his hands as always. William left this morning's early. He held up a drawing a horse, somewhat more skillfully rendered than any she had seen him attempt before. On the back, in William's careful letters, "For Miss Marsh." She took it and looked at it for a moment. "He's been practicing," she said. Every night, Thomas turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the drawing in her hands and then at her, and he said, with the particular difficulty of a man who has kept his own counsel for a long time and is now choosing not to, "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice was so plain and careful that it stopped her breath. "There is something I want to say to you, and I'm going to say it plainly because I don't know any other way." He looked at the floor for just a moment, the only hesitation she ever saw in him, and then back up at her, direct and clear. "I have been watching you for 2 months. I watch how you are with William, how you are with this town, with your work. I watch the way you handle what happened to you here, not with bitterness, not with self-pity, with sense and with grace. And I find that I have stopped being able to think about what this valley was like before you were in it." He paused. "I'm a man with a sheep ranch and a quiet boy and a lot of hard seasons ahead, and I am not going to pretend that's an easy offer. But I am asking you if you would consider staying, not as a courtesy, as my wife." The lamplight fell warm and steady across the room. Outside, the snow came down in silence, covering the bare ground of the schoolyard, covering the road, covering the whole world in a white quiet. Eleanor looked at this man, his honest face, his careful hands, the hat. He was still turning slowly in his fingers, and she thought of the letter she had burned, and the life she had left, and the one cracked window in this room, and the students who came to it every morning from all directions, and she thought of William, who had not spoken for months and had written her a question on a piece of paper about the fastest horse. She set the drawing on her desk beside the lamp. "Thomas," she said, "I came to Wyoming because a man wrote me a letter describing a life I wanted. And when I arrived, that life was gone, and I thought I had made the worst mistake of my judgment." She looked at him steadily. "I understand now that I was not wrong about the life. I was only wrong about the man." He went very still. "Is that a yes?" "That," she said, "is a yes." He let out a breath, slow and quiet, as though he had been holding it for longer than just this conversation. He set his hat on the desk beside the drawing and reached out and took her hand the way he did most things, directly, without excess, but with a steadiness that made it feel like something you could build on. Their wedding was in January, in the small church in Harlan, with the snow banked deep on either side of the road and the mountains brilliant and white against the blue sky. Mrs. Pendleton sat in the front pew and did not bother to hide that she was crying. The 16 schoolchildren, most of whom had been given the day off in honor of the occasion, crowded into the last 2 rows and were, with some effort, mostly quiet. William stood beside his father in his best coat, his carved horse in his pocket, and when the minister asked if anyone had cause to object, William looked around the room with an expression of such complete readiness to argue the matter that a low laugh moved through the gathered town. He did not object. He looked up at Eleanor as she came down the aisle, and he gave her the same small, deliberate wave he had given her from the wagon that snowy evening in October. She smiled at him, and he almost smiled back. In the spring, she moved her things from the boarding house out to the ranch. She had kept teaching through the winter, riding out each morning on the mare Thomas had bought for her without comment, a steady bay animal with a sensible disposition, and riding back each evening while the light lasted. She had made herself necessary in the town and useful in the house, and by the time the snow broke and the lower pasture flooded along the creek and then drained and dried in the first warm weeks of April, she had ceased to feel like a visitor anywhere. She planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing yard. She fixed the ledgers, which Thomas kept in the same confident disorder that ranchers who disliked arithmetic always kept them in, and she organized them so clearly that he stopped losing money on the wool contracts because he could finally see the numbers plainly. In June, she found wild lilacs growing along the creek bank, a whole tangle of them, lavender and white, and she transplanted 3 starts to the corner by the kitchen door. Thomas watched her do it from the porch without saying anything. That evening, as they sat in the long June dusk, he said, with the small precision of a man paying attention to something he intends to remember, "They'll take 2 years to bloom properly." "I know," she said. "I'll be here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a single satisfied nod, as though something had been confirmed to his exact expectations. 3 years later, on a morning in late May, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched the lilac bush by the door sway in a light wind. It had bloomed that week for the first time, full heavy clusters of pale purple that scented the whole yard in the mornings. William came around the corner of the barn on the young roan colt he had been training since the fall. He was 11 now, and the reticence he'd carried since his mother's death had transformed into a focused and eloquent person who saved his words for when they mattered and said a great deal with silence otherwise, exactly like his father. He sat that horse with the ease of someone who had been born knowing how. Behind her, she heard Thomas come in from the morning chores. He came and stood beside her at the window, smelling of cold air and hay. He looked out at William on the colt, and then at the lilac bush, in full bloom by the door. Eleanor held out her coffee. He took it, drank from it, handed it back. Their daughter, Clara, who was 14 months old, and had recently discovered that if she pulled herself up on the low fence rail, she could see over it into the sheep pen, was currently engaged in this endeavor, with the intense focus of a scholar. They could hear her making sounds at the sheep. The sheep were largely indifferent to her. "She's going to fall over that rail before noon," Thomas said. "She's going to be fine," Eleanor said. "She has your stubbornness. She has yours." He was not wrong. She looked out past the fence, past William and the colt, past the lower pasture to where the creek split the land in two, running clear and cold in the May morning. Beyond it, the mountains rose in their patient, enormous way. She had come to this valley on the strength of one man's false words and found another man whose words meant exactly what they said, every time, without exception. She had come looking for something she could not quite name and had, in the fullness of a few ordinary years, named it clearly. This, the coffee, and the window, and the lilacs by the door in their first spring bloom, and the boy on the roan colt who waved at her still, every morning, as he rode out. And the man beside her, who had asked her plainly, and waited with complete patience for her answer and had not once, given her reason to doubt that he meant every word. Outside, Clara lost her grip on the rail and sat down hard in the dirt. She looked at her hands for a moment with an expression of profound philosophical consideration. Then she grabbed the rail again and pulled herself right back up. Thomas made a quiet sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close. Eleanor looked at her daughter, bright-eyed and undeterred in the morning sun. She thought of a woman who had sat alone on an empty train platform with $11 and a burned-down hope and made herself stand up and try again. She thought that some things run in families before they are even taught. The mountains were very bright today. The lilacs moved in the light wind. The creek ran cold and clear through the pasture, just as the first letters had promised, through the driest days of any year. It was not the life she had been promised. It was better. It was real. Sometimes the life we planned falls apart so completely that we are left standing alone in a strange place with almost nothing, and it turns out that is exactly where we needed to be. Eleanor did not find her home by following the path she had mapped. She found it by staying steady when the map was gone, by doing the next honest thing, and by trusting that quiet, patient goodness in others and in herself was worth believing in. It usually is. A small note for you: this story was imagined and written by AI, crafted to bring you a few warm, entertaining moments and, hopefully, one small idea worth carrying into your day.